Welcome to the Ozarks, Missouri, 1882. A place where the hills were older than the country itself, where stories didn't just live, they lingered. The town of Marshfield was a quiet one, tucked between walnut forests and streams that whispered secrets to anyone who cared to listen. The people were simple: farmers, traders, blacksmiths, all trying to forget the scars left by the Civil War just 20 years earlier. In this town lived two sisters, Margaret and Eleanor Caldwell. Margaret, 23, had the kind of strength you could see in her hands, the hands of someone who worked hard and didn't complain. Eleanor was younger, 19, restless, always looking at the horizon like she could see another life waiting for her just beyond those hills. Their father, Thomas Caldwell, ran the hardware store on Main Street. He'd been a widower since typhoid took his wife 3 years before. Those girls were all he had left. On October 27, 1882, the sisters told him they were leaving. Their Aunt Sarah, their mother's sister, was sick down in Springfield, 50 miles south. The letter said she needed family, and family was sacred in those parts. Thomas hesitated. 50 miles might not sound like much, but in the Ozarks back then, it was 2 days by wagon, through woods so thick the sun barely touched the dirt. Roads were mud and rock, and people disappeared. But Margaret was determined. "We'll be fine, Pa," she said. "We'll stay in Seymour by nightfall, and Aunt Sarah the next day." So Thomas packed their wagon himself, food for 3 days, fresh blankets, and a little bag of coins tied in leather. He kissed them both goodbye. The sky was gray that morning, the kind that hides the mountains in mist. A few neighbors waved as the sisters left, their wagon rolling toward the hills. Nobody knew they'd never make it to Springfield. That evening, in Seymour, an innkeeper named Jeremiah Walsh waited for two familiar faces who didn't arrive. He'd known the Caldwell girls for years, always polite, always traveling the same road. But that night the room stayed empty. By November 1st, their Aunt Sarah had grown worried. She sent a telegram north to Marshfield: "Girls not arrived. Please advise." It took 2 days to reach Thomas. When he read it, the blood drained from his face. He didn't wait. The next morning, he mounted his horse and rode south, retracing the route his daughters had taken. The roads were slick with mud, trees leaning like old sentinels watching him pass. The deeper he rode, the quieter it got. By the time he reached Seymour, dusk had fallen. Jeremiah Walsh came out to meet him, lantern in hand. "They never came through, Thomas," he said quietly. "Not that night. Not since." That was when panic turned to dread. The next morning, a search party of 15 men left Seymour at dawn, farmers, traders, neighbors, all armed with rifles and lanterns. They fanned out along the winding road north, calling the girls' names through the fog. "Margaret! Eleanor!" The woods didn't answer. Then, just after noon, one of them, a young man named Peter Hutchkins, noticed something strange. Wagon tracks, deep in the mud, leading off the main road and down a narrow trail no traveler should have taken. The men followed. The air grew colder, trees thicker, the ground wet and silent under the hooves. After nearly a mile, they reached a small clearing. There, half buried in leaves, lay the sisters' wagon. It was tipped on its side, one wheel broken, provisions scattered, bread molded, a water jug shattered. But the horses were gone. And so were the girls. Thomas knelt beside the wagon, his hands shaking as he picked up a torn wool cloak. Eleanor's. He recognized the stitching, his late wife's work. No blood, no bodies, just silence so deep it rang in his ears. The men searched until dark, torches flickering against the cold mist. They found a shoe, Margaret's, an empty coin pouch, nothing else. Then Cornelius Black, an old farmer who knew those hills like the back of his hand, spoke up. "There's an old cabin not far from here," he said. "Been abandoned for years. Folks say strange things happen near it. Maybe we ought to look." Thomas's face hardened. "Lead the way." As the sun set, the men followed Black deeper into the forest, toward a ruin that locals whispered about but never dared to visit. The search for the Caldwell sisters had become something else entirely. They were about to uncover something buried not just in the woods, but in the bones of the Ozarks themselves. When the search party found the sisters' wagon, the men stood in uneasy silence. The forest seemed to lean in on them, branches heavy with mist, every breath visible in the cold air. The wagon lay on its side in a shallow clearing, one wheel shattered, the contents scattered like bones. Bread had turned green, cheese was half-eaten by animals, a broken jug glistened with rainwater. The horses were gone. The sisters were gone. Thomas Caldwell dropped to one knee beside the wreck. He lifted a torn piece of blue cloth from a thorn bush and knew it instantly. It was part of Margaret's traveling dress. His heart hammered so hard he could hear it in his ears. He looked around the clearing, seeing shapes in every shadow, hoping one of them might move, might speak, might end this nightmare. But the woods gave him nothing. The others searched the ground for print. Peter Hutchkins, the youngest of the group, found the faint impressions of wagon wheels that veered from the road and stopped here. There were footprints, too, some small and light, perhaps the sisters', and others larger, deeper, made by heavy boots. Thomas's throat went dry. Whoever those boots belonged to had been close enough to touch his daughters. As evening settled, the men built a small fire to mark the site. They would continue at first light. But Thomas did not sleep. He sat by the ruins of the wagon, staring into the dark until the stars blurred, whispering his daughters' names as though the forest might whisper them back. At dawn, Cornelius Black approached quietly. He was older than the rest, a farmer with hands like rough stone and a face carved by years of work. "There's a trail yonder," he said, pointing through the trees. "Used to lead to an old logger's hut. Been empty for years." Thomas nodded without hesitation. The others followed. The path was narrow, overgrown, littered with roots that caught their boot. The deeper they went, the heavier the air felt. When they reached the cabin, half its roof had collapsed, vines strangling the walls. Yet there were footprints, fresh ones, pressed into the mud around the door. Boot prints again. Thomas pushed the door open. It swung inward with a groan, and a wave of damp, sour air rolled out. Inside, everything was gray, ashes on the hearth, dead leaves on the floor, spiderwebs thick as gauze. In one corner stood a broken table. Against the far wall, Hutchkins noticed something fluttering, a scrap of blue cloth snagged on a nail. Thomas's breath caught. It matched the piece he'd found by the wagon. He stepped closer, touched it, and saw that it had torn, not cut. Someone had struggled here. The walls bore faint scratches, and in the dirt near the hearth were marks of something heavy being dragged. The men searched the cabin from floor to rafters. They found empty bottles, rust-stained ropes, a few animal bones. But no sign of the girls. Outside, Cornelius studied the boot prints again. They led into the forest and disappeared toward the east, where the land dropped into deeper valleys. Whoever had been here knew the terrain. Thomas clenched the fabric in his fist. "They were alive when they reached this place," he said quietly. "And if they left, someone took them." They returned to Seymour that night, weary and silent. Thomas refused to rest. Before dawn he was saddled again, ready to follow the tracks himself. The other men joined him. No one could bear to let him ride alone. By midday, the hounds arrived, 3 scent dogs borrowed from August Weber's farm. The men let them smell the sisters' cloaks, then turned them loose. The dogs circled the clearing, whining, noses to the ground, before bolting eastward into the woods. The men followed on foot. The trail twisted through ravines and over streams that soaked their boot. After nearly 2 miles, the dogs slowed near a narrow valley where a cold stream ran between moss-covered rock. They whined and sat down, refusing to go farther. Thomas knelt, dipped his hand into the water, and felt the chill bite his skin. The surface looked clean, but something about it felt wrong, as though the air itself was holding its breath. Then Hutchkins called out. On the opposite bank were drag marks, deep grooves leading into a wall of limestone where the rock split open like a wound. Thomas crossed the stream, stones slick beneath his feet, and stared into the darkness of the opening. It was a cave mouth, narrow but deep, the edges worn smooth by years of running water. He turned to the men behind him. "They're in there," he said. No one argued. They lit lanterns and stepped inside. The cave swallowed them quickly. The light from the entrance faded until only the lantern glow painted the wet stone walls. Water dripped steadily somewhere ahead. The air smelled of minerals and rot. Their footsteps echoed, each one chased by silence. After several minutes, Thomas's lantern caught something on the ground, a small, leather-bound book, half buried in gravel. He picked it up and wiped the cover clean. It was a prayer book. Inside the front page, written in neat, fading ink, was the name Eleanor Marie Caldwell. Thomas closed his eyes. "They were here," he whispered. The men pressed on. The tunnel sloped downward, twisting, splitting into 2, then 3 paths. Thomas chose the middle one, guided by instinct and fear. The walls began to close in, forcing them to move single file. Their breath came loud in the tight air. And then, without warning, the passage opened into a chamber the size of a barn. The lantern light reached up and revealed stalactites hanging like teeth. On the ground lay the remnants of a fire, long dead, surrounded by empty cans and scraps of hide. Thomas raised his lantern higher, and saw the walls. They were covered in markings, clusters of 5 tall scratches, row after row, dozens of them. Not random, counted. Days, perhaps months. Someone had lived down here, marking time in stone. Hutchkins stepped toward the wall. 63 sets, he said. Who would count that long? Thomas didn't answer. He had already noticed the pile in the corner. Clothes, shoes, hats, all in different sizes, some fresh, some rotting. He reached down and lifted a brooch with the initials G.H. engraved into the silver. Next to it lay a pocket watch, frozen at 3:15. Beneath that, a wedding dress yellowed with age. The fabric was stiff, spotted with something dark. The chamber seemed to grow smaller as realization settled over them. These weren't just lost belongings. They were trophies. This cave had been a prison, and a grave. Cornelius Black looked toward another narrow tunnel at the far end. A faint draft stirred the lantern flames. "It goes deeper," he said. "Much deeper." Thomas squared his shoulders. "Then that's where we'll go." And with that, he stepped forward into the black throat of the mountain, the others following close behind, their lights trembling on the stone. The deeper they went, the colder it became. The light from their lanterns caught beads of water dripping from the ceiling and the gleam of limestone that looked almost alive. The walls sweated and breathed. Each step echoed a second too long, as if the cave itself were repeating their movements. The men spoke little now. The sound of their boots on wet rock was enough to fill the silence. Behind them, the way out had already disappeared into blackness. Only the dim glow of the lanterns proved there was still a world beyond the mountain. Thomas Caldwell led the way. His face was drawn and pale, his jaw locked tight. He kept one hand on the wall as he moved, as though the stone could guide him where reason could not. Hutchkins followed close behind, his lantern casting wild shadows across the uneven floor. The others trailed in a line, every man aware that they were walking deeper than any sane person should. After what felt like hours, they reached a slope that fell away sharply. The path ahead was slick, the air thicker. Somewhere below, they heard the faint rush of water. Thomas raised his lantern and saw that the tunnel widened again into a vast chamber, the ceiling lost in darkness. They stepped inside. The ground was uneven, pocked with puddles. In the center of the space lay the remains of an old fire, ashes gray and scattered, a ring of charred stones marking where someone had once camped. Around it were empty tins, bones gnawed clean, and scraps of animal hide. Thomas's lantern swept across the walls, and his breath caught. There were scratches, hundreds of them, cut into the limestone. Each one grouped in 5s, tall and deliberate, stretching in long rows like tally marks in a cell. He traced them with his fingers. Some were deep and sharp, others worn smooth by time. Whoever made them had lived here long enough to count not hours, but days, maybe months. He turned to the others. "These aren't new," he said. "They've been here for years." Cornelius Black bent closer. "Or decades," he muttered. "You don't make walls like that in a week." In one corner of the chamber, Hutchkins knelt beside a pile of rags. But when he lifted them, they were not rags at all, they were clothes. Torn dresses, shoes with broken laces, a child's bonnet. He froze, staring at the mound. "God help us," he whispered. Thomas joined him. Beneath the fabric lay small objects. A pocket watch, its glass cracked and hands frozen at 3:15. A woman's brooch engraved with initials. A man's hat, dark with dried stains. And near the bottom, almost buried, a wedding dress yellowed with age. The lace was delicate, hand-stitched, the kind used 20 years before. Across the bodice, brown marks had spread like rust. It did not take imagination to know what they were. Thomas's stomach turned. He backed away, gripping the lantern to steady himself. The flickering light trembled across his face, showing a mixture of disbelief and rage. "He's been doing this for years," he said. "This isn't just about my daughters." They stood there in silence, the horror settling around them like the chill of the cave. All the stories, all the disappearances along the Springfield road, they weren't accidents. They weren't bandits or wild animals. They were this place, this man. At the far end of the chamber, the tunnel continued, a narrow crack in the stone barely wide enough for one man to pass at a time. A faint draft moved through it, carrying the smell of earth and water. Hutchkins shone his lantern into the gap. "It keeps going," he said quietly. "Looks like it drops again." Thomas didn't hesitate. "Then we go." The men squeezed through the passage, shoulders scraping the wet stone. The air thinned. It was harder to breathe now, the smell of minerals heavy in their lungs. The tunnel twisted and turned, sloping downward. They could hear water more clearly, a low roar that grew louder with every step. Then, without warning, the ground leveled out and the tunnel opened into another chamber, larger still. The ceiling soared into blackness. An underground river cut through the center, its current black and fast. The sound filled the space like a living thing. On the far bank, Thomas's lantern caught a flicker of movement. A shape hunched near the water's edge. A person. He held up his hand to stop the others and stared. The figure was bent over something on the ground, the motion deliberate, rhythmic. For a moment Thomas thought it might be one of his daughters tending to another, but then the man turned. His hair was long and matted, his clothes patched together from rags. His eyes reflected the lantern light like an animal's. He was large, broad-shouldered, his hands rough and scarred. He blinked against the light, then smiled, a slow, crooked smile that didn't belong on any sane man's face. "Well," he said, his voice startlingly calm, "it's been a long time since anyone's come to visit." Thomas froze. The voice was educated, clear, but wrong somehow, stretched at the edges by years of talking to no one. "What have you done with my daughters?" he demanded. His voice echoed off the walls, swallowed by the roar of the river. The man tilted his head. "Your daughters," he said softly. "The mountain sent them. The river takes who it wants. I only keep them safe until it's ready." He stepped aside, and Thomas saw what lay on the ground. A young woman bound by her wrists, her dress torn, her face pale and still. "Eleanor." Thomas lunged forward before anyone could stop him. The man moved with surprising speed, catching him by the coat and throwing him back. The air rushed from Thomas's lungs as he hit the rock floor. The others surged forward. Hutchkins grabbed a loose torch from the wall and swung it. The flame caught the man's shoulder, and he screamed, a raw, guttural sound, but didn't fall. "You don't understand," he shouted. "They come to me. They always come. The mountain gives, and the river takes." Thomas stumbled to his feet, his face streaked with blood and dust. He didn't hear the words anymore. He charged again, tackling the man near the edge of the river. They rolled, striking the rock, their grunts lost beneath the roar of water. Hutchkins cut Eleanor's ropes, his hands shaking. "You're safe," he whispered. "Your father's here." She blinked weakly, lips moving but no sound coming out. Her skin was ice-cold. Behind them, Thomas and the man struggled dangerously close to the current. The man's strength was inhuman, driven by madness and years of isolation. He grinned through the blows, repeating the same words again and again. "The river always takes, the river always takes." Thomas grabbed a rock and struck him across the head. Once, twice. The man staggered, blood dark on his temple. For a heartbeat, he smiled again, a smile that froze Thomas where he stood. Then he fell backward into the water. The river swallowed him whole. There was no cry, no splash beyond the first, only the endless sound of rushing water. He was gone. Thomas collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath. Hutchkins helped him up, guiding him to where Eleanor lay. She was alive, though barely conscious. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "Daddy?" Thomas pulled her close and held her as if the act alone could keep her in the world. They would later find Margaret in another chamber, chained but breathing. There were others too, women in rags, eyes vacant, the survivors of years no one had known existed. But in that moment, standing beside the black river deep beneath the Ozarks, Thomas Caldwell could think of only one thing: both his daughters were alive. And the monster who had haunted those mountains was finally gone. Or so he thought. The river that ran through the heart of the mountain seemed endless, its voice echoing off the walls like a hymn for the dead. When the man fell into it, his body vanished almost instantly, swallowed by the black current. For a long time, no one spoke. The men stood still, staring into the dark water, waiting for him to surface. He never did. Thomas knelt beside Eleanor again, pressing his hand to her cheek. She was cold, but her pulse was steady. Behind him, Hutchkins had found Margaret, chained to the wall in a smaller chamber just beyond. Her wrists were raw, her lips cracked from thirst, but she was alive. When her father appeared in the doorway, she blinked once, then whispered his name. That was all she could manage before tears overtook her. They freed her with a hammer and chisel one of the men carried for the search. The iron links gave way with sharp, painful echoes that seemed too loud in that suffocating space. When Margaret was finally free, she collapsed into her father's arms. He held her without words. For all that he'd imagined, for all that he'd feared, he had never thought he would feel their hearts beating against him again. The survivors, there were 4 besides the Caldwell sisters, moved like ghosts. Their faces were pale, their eyes unfocused. Some could barely stand. The men wrapped them in coats and blankets, giving water from their flask. Every few minutes, one of the women would flinch at a sound that wasn't there. It was as if the cave still breathed behind them. Thomas turned to Hutchkins. "We're getting out," he said. "Now." They made their way back through the tunnels, the lanterns flickering as the air shifted. The way out seemed longer than before, the passages narrower. Every shadow looked like movement, every echo like a footstep that wasn't their own. None of them dared look back. When they finally saw daylight, it was faint and gray, the mouth of the cave no bigger than the frame of a door. One by one they emerged into the open air. The morning mist was still clinging to the trees, and the forest seemed impossibly bright after the dark below. Margaret shielded her eyes, breathing in the cold air as if it were the first clean breath she'd taken in years. Eleanor fell to her knees in the moss and began to sob quietly. Thomas looked back at the black opening. There was no sign of the man who had lived there, no body in the river, no sound from the depths. The cave sat silent, pretending innocence. He wanted to seal it forever, to bury the evil that had taken root beneath those hills. But he also knew that evil like that didn't die. It only moved, waiting for another story to tell itself. The group built a stretcher from branches and rope for the weakest survivors. It took them nearly the whole day to reach Seymour. By the time they arrived, the townspeople had gathered at the edge of the square, watching in stunned silence as the exhausted procession appeared out of the trees. No one spoke until Thomas stopped in front of the old courthouse steps and lowered Margaret gently to the ground. Then, all at once, the questions began. Did you find them? What happened? Who did this? Thomas didn't answer. His face was hollow, his clothes torn, his hands trembling with a mix of exhaustion and rage. He simply said, "They're safe now. But there's a place in those hills no man should ever go." Doctors and neighbors took the survivors in. Word spread quickly, first through the town, then the county, then across the state. Newspapers came calling, but the details never matched. Some said the man in the cave was a hermit gone mad. Others claimed he was part of a family of outlaws who'd vanished after the war. A few whispered that he wasn't entirely human at all, that he'd been there long before the Caldwells, long before the war, maybe even before the towns. The authorities sent a team to investigate the site a week later. They found the cave, but little else. No bodies, no bones, no signs of life except for the markings on the walls, hundreds of them, tallies that went higher than anyone could count. And deep within the chamber, the river still flowed, dark and relentless, as if it had swallowed every trace of the man who once lived there. The Caldwell sisters recovered slowly. Margaret's hands healed, though the scars never faded. Eleanor spoke rarely after that. She would sit by the window for hours, staring toward the southern hills, flinching at any sound of rushing water. Their father kept the store running, but he was not the same man. His hair turned white within a year. He avoided questions, avoided crowds. Some nights, neighbors claimed they saw him riding out toward the hills, stopping at the edge of the woods before turning back. He never said why. In time, the story became legend. People called it the Caldwell disappearance, then the Ozark sisters. Parents told it to their children as a warning: don't stray from the roads, don't follow strange paths, and never, ever go near the caves after dark. But as the years passed, the truth blurred. What had been terror became folklore. The cabin fell apart, the cave was sealed by rockfall, and the names of the survivors faded from the records. Still, on quiet nights, when the wind moves through those valleys just right, some locals swear they can hear it, the faint sound of water rushing beneath the earth, and a voice murmuring from below. Not crying, not screaming, but counting. Always counting. The story of the Caldwell sisters should have ended the day they walked out of those woods. For a while it did. The town of Marshfield tried to forget. The newspapers moved on. And the hills, as always, kept their secrets. But legends don't die, they wait. And sometimes they whisper. Nearly 40 years later, in the spring of 1921, a prospector named William Kersey bought a small tract of land near the southern edge of Webster County, not far from where the Caldwells had vanished decades before. He was a quiet man, a veteran of the Great War who'd returned from France with a limp and a habit of talking to himself. Locals said he came to the Ozarks to escape the noise of the world. Kersey built himself a shack near a creek that wound through the foothills. The water was clear and cold, the kind that came straight out of the limestone. He spent his days panning for minerals and writing in a small journal that no one but him ever read. For the first few weeks it was peace, the kind he'd been chasing since the trenches. Then the dreams began. In the first dream, he stood by the creek under a red moon. He could hear water rushing beneath the ground, like a river hidden under his feet. A voice whispered through the noise, soft, rhythmic, counting numbers he didn't understand. He woke drenched in sweat, the sound still echoing in his ears. The next night, the voice came again, closer. This time it said his name. He tried to tell himself it was nothing, just the loneliness of the hills playing tricks on him. But when he walked to the creek the next morning, he saw something strange. The water had dropped several feet overnight, exposing a patch of rock that hadn't been visible before. And in the center of that rock was an opening, narrow, black, breathing cold air from the depths below. Kersey stared into it for a long time. Then he turned back toward his cabin and started packing his things. He never made it out. 3 days later, a local farmhand passing through found Kersey's horse still tied to the post, stamping nervously. The door to the cabin stood open. Inside, the bed was unmade, a tin cup knocked to the floor, and a journal lying open on the table. The last line written in shaky pencil read, "Asterisk, it's still down there. The river never stopped." Asterisk. When the sheriff's men searched the area, they found the hole by the creek exactly as Kersey described. It went deep, too deep to see the bottom. The smell that rose from it was wet and old, like something that had been sleeping for a long, long time. They lowered a lantern on a rope. It swung in the darkness for nearly a full minute before touching ground. When they pulled it back up, the glass was cracked and the light was out. They filled the hole with stone and earth, and the matter was quietly dropped. Kersey was never found. Over the years, people said the ground near that creek was cursed. Livestock refused to graze there. Hikers heard things underfoot, murmurs, like a dozen voices whispering at once. Some said they saw shapes in the mist, moving along the water's edge, pale and barefoot. In 1933, a highway crew widening Route 60 unearthed the remains of an old wooden wagon wheel half buried in the clay. The metal rim was rusted, but the wood was intact. On the inner spoke, carved faintly into the grain, were 2 letters, E.C. The foreman took it as a curiosity, a relic of the pioneer days, and left it by the roadside. But one of the workers, a man named Harold Finch, kept it. He mounted the piece on his barn wall as decoration. 3 months later, his barn caught fire during a lightning storm and burned to the ground. Finch swore, just before the flames reached the rafters, he heard something over the crackle of the fire, a woman's voice, whispering from deep within the walls, counting slowly. No one believed him, of course. Not really. In Marshfield, the Caldwell name faded into history. The store closed after Thomas's death. Margaret never married. Eleanor was institutionalized in 1891 after a nervous collapse. She lived another 20 years in a sanitarium outside St. Louis. Her records show only 2 notes under remarks: recurring nightmares and auditory hallucinations, water sounds. By the time the century turned, the old stories were nothing but campfire tales. Children dared each other to walk to the southern woods and knock on the stones said to hide the entrance of the cave. Most came back laughing. Some said they heard something when they put their ear to the ground, a faint trickle of water where no stream ran. And so it remains. The Ozarks look the same today as they did then, quiet, beautiful, and full of secrets. The hills hold their stories, and the rivers run deep beneath them. Somewhere in those valleys, under layers of earth and time, that river still flows. If you stand close enough, on a cold morning when the fog sits low, you might just hear it. Not the water. The whisper beneath it. Counting. Always counting.